If you can master the aggressive volley, you'll be able to prevent 90% of players from moving forward. However, most players don't know what type of aggressive volley to use depending on the situation. To the average player, aggressive volleys might all look the same, but there's 4 key variations that you have to understand. I highly recommend watching the full video so that you know how to use these and when to use them depending on the shot. All right, so watch these volleys. They might all look the same, but they're actually very different, and you use them at different times. So the first aggressive volley that you have to know, probably the most important, is called the roll. So the roll, sometimes called the topspin roll, looks like this. It's very similar to the flick, which I'm going to teach you as well, but the key difference between the roll and the flick is that generally you use a roll when your opponents are back. So the goal of the roll is to get a bunch of topspin on the ball to go at your opponent's feet to prevent them from moving forward. So a good roll looks like this. And the higher the ball goes, the harder that you can hit the roll. And you can do the same thing on the forehand side too. You just ride up the back of the ball with topspin to get that ball jetting at your opponent when it hits the ground. Later in the video, I'm going to take you step by step through the technique, so stay tuned. The next type of aggressive volley you need to know is the flick. So the flick is very similar to the roll, but the key difference is that I'm getting a lot of my power from my wrist. So the roll is more arm, and the flick is more wrist. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is when you're hitting the flick, a lot of the time you're really reaching for it, so you don't really have as much of an ability to use your full arm. The other reason is that by using your wrist, it's a lot more deceptive. So you can kind of pretend you're hitting a dink or a softer shot, and then at the last second, you flick it for that power. The third of these volleys is what we call the poke. So the poke is less common, but it's still really important, and you use this as your opponents are moving forward. So if your opponent hits you a good drop, you use the poke to sort of get right at their feet like that so they can't attack on that next shot. So it's more of a surrender shot. It's not quite as aggressive, but it still keeps you in an advantageous position. And the reason I'm showing most of these volleys with a backhand is because when you're at the kitchen, you should be covering your body with your backhand. So most of the time you're hitting a backhand volley. That said, I'm going to show you the technique on the forehand too. The fourth volley is what we call the punch. And the whole point of this volley is that you use it to defend against drives. So just because your opponent's hitting the ball hard at you doesn't mean you can't keep them back. And the reason you use this is because it's a more firm volley, so you can use it better to absorb power. When your opponents are hitting the ball hard at you, you don't want to be using a bunch of wrist and a bunch of spin. You need to have a firm wrist so that you can use their own power against them. All right, so now let's go through the technique of each one of these volleys. Make sure to pay close attention so that you know how to do this next time you go and play at the courts. So the first one is the roll. So the main difference between the roll and the flick is the source of power. So the main source of power on my roll is by raising my shoulder up like this. This is also the main source of my spin. And the reason we do this on the roll and we don't do this on the flick is because when our opponents are back, they already know we're going to hit hard if we get a shot like this. So we don't need to disguise it like we do on the flick by using our wrist. So this is essentially the best way to hit a topspin volley, the most efficient way to hit a topspin volley, and the most consistent. And the better that you get at this shot, the more you can add that flick that you also use on the roll. So it's not all coming from your shoulder. So that looks like this. And that'll just give you that extreme spin that makes it hard for your opponents to time the ball. And on the forehand, the technique's exactly the same. I ride up the ball with my shoulder, and I can add a little bit of this flick to get that extra spin. So a good roll on the forehand side looks like this. Very similar, very simple shot. The whole point is to keep your opponents back with that spin and power. So to show you a close-up of the roll technique, all you need to know is that it starts with the feet. So I'm square to the court. If I need to move side to side, I'm going to be doing it like this. And all you need to do on this shot is ride up the back of the ball with your shoulder, throwing a little bit of wrist for that extra spin. Pretty simple technique. All right, so now I'm going to show you the technique of the flick. And the main thing that makes the flick different is that most of your power is coming from your wrist. So the first thing to keep in mind on a flick is that when you're hitting it, your paddle needs to be pointing down a little bit before you hit the ball. And then as you hit it, it sort of flexes up and forward like this. And the reason we're doing this is because a lot of the time we're really leaning, and this is the only way we can get power. So to show you a few examples, see, I'm coming up the back of the ball. There's not really much of a swing at all, but I can still hit it pretty hard because I'm using my wrist. And the key on the flick, one of the keys, is that if you want a more powerful flick, you also kind of want to use your elbow very slightly so that your wrist gets more of an action. Your wrist is not a very strong muscle on its own, so just adding a little bit of elbow gets you that power that makes it hard for your opponents to respond to the shot. And one thing I want to mention is that if you don't have a strong wrist, this shot's going to be pretty hard to hit. So you might actually need to strengthen your forearm and your wrist a little bit before you can use this shot effectively. There's a bunch of ways to do that. You can use a band, you can go home and do some exercises with a weight, but just know that if you've never hit this shot and you start trying it, it might feel like your wrist is hurting or your forearm just isn't strong enough. So keep that in mind. But to show you a few more examples, I'm riding up the back of the ball, and what's cool about the flick and what you should do, especially if you're in a dinking situation, is before you hit it, you should try to pretend like you're hitting a dink. So it should look like I'm hitting a dink or a volley dink, and then when the shot gets to me, I change my mind and I flick it really hard. So by doing that, that's how you get the deception aspect of the flick, and your opponents don't know that you're gonna hit it hard until the last second. On the forehand, it's the same thing. You pretend like you're gonna hit a dink, and then you add that little wrist action, which you can get a lot of power and a lot of spin from that. So it looks like I'm gonna hit a volley dink, and then I accelerate. In terms of the poke, you can think of the poke as a softer roll volley. So a poke looks like this. A lot of the time when I'm hitting the poke, I'm really reaching into the kitchen. So that's one of the main reasons you use this shot. Also, a lot of the time your opponent's trying to move forward. So I'm kind of hitting a softer volley as I'm reaching at their feet to prevent them from coming in. So it's sort of a deceptive shot because you don't know if I'm gonna hit a dink or a roll, and a lot of the time I'm really reaching. But most of your power, if not all your power, is coming from your shoulder. You're keeping your wrist steady, but you're still getting topspin by riding up the back of the ball. If you're confused about the difference between a roll and a poke at all you need to know is that the poke, because we're reaching so far, we're kind of just like poking it. We're just jabbing it a little bit, and we're hitting it a little bit softer. So a roll is more of a full swing, a flick is with our wrist, and a poke is sort of just a topspin jab. Now guys, I'm gonna show you the technique of the punch volley. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention that if you don't have a gritty paddle that gets a lot of spin, you're not gonna be as effective when you hit your rolls, your flicks, and your pokes. So if you're looking for a paddle upgrade and you want something that has a ton of grit, this is our paddle, the Banger. Right now we're running a deal on it where if you use code YouTube, you get $20 off, which makes this way too cheap for how good of a paddle it is. Another additional benefit of this paddle is that it's an edgeless paddle, which means that it has a lower swing weight, which means it's easier to sort of go like this. So if you have trouble at all when it comes to roll volleys or flicks with your forearm or your wrist, this paddle makes it a lot easier to accelerate, which gives you more spin and more power. So if you're interested in this paddle, head to our site and use code YouTube for $20 off. All right, so let's get back into the punch volley. So the punch volley is what we use when we're defending against our opponent's drive, so powerful shots. And the main thing that makes this volley different is that you lock your wrist and you want to have a tighter grip on the paddle. Because if you have a loose grip on the paddle when your opponents are hitting drives, there's a higher chance that off-center hits will cause mishits and make the ball go in the net or pop the ball up. So we use a tighter grip here so that if we accidentally miss the center, we still have a good result and the paddle doesn't shift so much in our hands. In terms of the technique, there's a reason it's called the punch volley. You're essentially just punching towards your target. You don't want there to be too much elevation, or you don't want to be going down too much. It should be a very level shot so that you don't miss time when the shot is coming. By going towards your target and keeping it level, there's a very low chance you miss the volley because it just makes it easier to time the power. So this is what a backhand punch volley looks like. You extend towards your target and you keep your wrist nice and firm so that you can hit the ball nice and deep at your opponent's feet. And a forehand punch volley, same thing. You're punching towards your target. You want a steady wrist, and it looks just like this. So I'm not really using much wrist at all. On a slower drive, you can maybe add a little bit of topspin. On a harder drive, I wouldn't try to. Just try to hit the ball flat with no spin, and that'll give you the highest possible chance of hitting a successful punch volley. And in terms of where to aim these different volleys, they're different shots, but you actually aim them in similar places. The main thing that determines where you aim is where your opponent is standing. So if my opponent's back, whether or not she's using a drive or a drop, I want to aim at the depth of her feet. So if she's hitting a drive and she's trying to come forward, I want to get at the depth of her feet out to her side. So if she's back, that means I'm going to be going deep. But as she starts to come forward, I want to go somewhere around here or somewhere around here. This is what makes it as hard as possible for her to move forward. So regardless of where she's standing, I'm taking my punch volleys and my rolls at the depth of her feet out to her side. See, that's a really tough shot to get back. And if I go too deep, she can sort of pick it off out of the air. So I want to go at the depth of her feet out to her sides. As she starts to move forward even more, I'm going to go even softer so that I can still get it at her feet. So if she's standing right here, this is where I might use my poke to sort of get it right at her feet like that. Maybe that's starting a dinking rally, but it still makes it tough. She might pop that ball up and I can attack the next one. So as they move forward, you start to go more and more at their feet. When she gets to the kitchen though, if I'm hitting an attacking volley, I'm not going at her feet anymore. I don't have a good enough angle most of the time unless I have a really high ball. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna start going for what I call my speed up targets. So speed up targets are different in that because you can't get it at your opponent's feet, you aim for different weak points. So the three main speed up targets are down the middle, at the right shoulder or right hip for righties, and down the line. So if I'm going for a flick volley that arises from a dinking situation, I'm gonna try to go down the middle, at my opponent's right shoulder or right hip, or if they leave that down the line spot open, I can go there too. Just know you're not going to be going at the same targets based on where your opponent's standing. And guys, if you hit a good aggressive volley, odds are your opponent's going to give you a high ball that you can try to end the point with. The first tip in this next video covers that, so if you want an explanation of it, watch this. If you're watching this video, you probably understand the basics of good pickleball strategy. However, as you progress through the sport, there's multiple things that no one talks about that you need to know. These are double strategies that are less obvious, but work extremely well. If you're trying to improve, I highly recommend you watch this full video so that you can try out all these tips the next time you go play. Helping me today, I have my sister Kennedy.